Northwest Toxic Communities Coalition would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar on the health effects of 5G. A recording will be made of today's presentation and placed on the NWTCC's website, where you'll be able to watch it again or send the link out to friends and family. The NWTCC is especially grateful to Dr. Carpenter for his willingness to share his expertise to help others, especially non-technology people, understand the dangers posed by 5G. Please use the chat for any questions you have for the Q&A that follows. David O. Carpenter is a public health physician whose current position is director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at the University at Albany, as well as professor of, of environmental health sciences within the School of Public Health at the University at Albany. Please welcome Dr. Carpenter.
Well, thank you. This isn't exactly the title that this was announced for, but it's really pretty important because you can't really understand the issues around 5G unless you have some understanding of the concerns we have about 2, 3, and 4G, G being generation. And as time has gone on, the bandwidth of electromagnetic fields that are used for communication frequencies have changed and developed. So this slide shows you the electromagnetic spectrum. What most people know about the electromagnetic spectrum is visible light. And the difference between red and violet is a matter of the wavelength of the electromagnetic fields. So electromagnetic fields are packages of energy that have no mass. And they range from the extra low frequencies, those that we use for electricity, 60 hertz in this country, and they go all the way up to very, very high frequencies from cosmic rays and gamma rays. And therefore, we usually divide the electromagnetic spectrum when we're talking about it like I am today into two groups: the ionizing portion, that being the very high frequency X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, that have sufficient energy so that they can break DNA bonds, they can ionize. They clearly have adverse health effects, although EMF in that range also has beneficial effects as used for things like radiation therapy for treatment of cancer. Below that, you have the visible, well, first the ultraviolet light, then visible light. And below visible light in frequency, we have infrared radiation. So clearly, without visible light and infrared radiation coming from the sun, which heats the earth, without either of those, life would not be possible. So we know there are health hazards from the ionizing portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then we have, as we go less in frequency, visible light and infrared radiation, without which life would not be possible. And so the question is, at frequencies below that, are there concerns about health effects? And I hope I can convince you that there are concerns, even though, as for ionizing radiation, there are beneficial uses. And our societies are very, very dependent on electromagnetic waves for everything from electricity to radio and television to cell phones and cell towers and all that level of communication. So if you start from the lower end, extra low radiation is that up to a frequency that's something like kilohertz. And then radio and television are increasingly higher frequencies. Finally, you get to cell phones and cell towers and microwave ovens. And what's happened over time as communications have developed, we've gone from the lower frequencies used for radio and television to higher and higher frequencies now used for cell phones and so forth. The current use for communication frequencies are in the high megahertz range. But now 5G is yet higher frequencies in the gigahertz range And they are being employed as being frequencies that will carry much more information much more rapidly. You should be able to download a movie within microseconds, not half a minute. But let me go through the health effects that starting with the radio frequency fields, and I'll come back and talk a lot about 5G at the end of my talk. All right, so the communications frequencies are basically microwaves. They're the same microwaves that drive your microwave oven. It's just that when you use your cell phone, the intensity is much less than your microwave oven. Obviously, if you can cook your potato or heat your lunch in a microwave oven, there is a potential danger from microwaves. Microwaves impact whether it's food or our bodies, and at high intensities, they cause tissue heating because they mobilize movement of water. So the cell phones are designed to use an intensity that doesn't cause tissue heating, but all electromagnetic fields travel at the speed of light. And this is why, your cell phone, you can call someone in the East Coast and you don't notice any delay. I can call someone in the West Coast and the same thing. So that's very useful. Now, the problem is that there is increasing evidence that excessive exposure to microwaves at intensities that do not cause tissue heating can increase the risk of a number of diseases. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about cancer from cell phones, because I think one needs to understand that before you go on to try to talk about the health effects or lack thereof, or what there might be from 5G radiation, which is going to be at a higher frequencies. Well, there's a lot of evidence that excessive use of your cell phone causes cancer, primarily brain cancer. And I'll show you some of the evidence, but it's gliomas and glioblastomas, the more serious form of brain cancer. They develop on the side of the head where someone uses their cell phone excessively. In addition, acoustic neuromas. This is a tumor of the auditory nerve. So it's not really a cancer, but it's a tumor that's in a bony canal. And so it causes deafness and pain, and that's a real problem. Clearly increased in results of using your cell phone too much. Finally, people are now demonstrating cancers of the parotid gland, the salivary gland in the cheek, the thyroid gland in the neck, and the throat in response to using a cell phone held to the head. And there are probably other cancers that are also increased. For example, there's now reports coming out that women that wear their active cell phone in their bra have an elevated risk of breast cancer. My daughter, who's a horse reproduction veterinarian, I caught her doing that, hollered at her, gave her all the reports showing elevations in breast cancer of people that wear their cell phone in their bra. First of all, it seems to me it would be pretty uncomfortable, but she said she needs her hands, both hands, and she needs to have her cell phone handy. So apparently that's quite a common practice in busy professional women. Well, let me show you some of the results from individual studies. Now, I suspect most of this audience understands what odds ratios are, but maybe not everyone does. So let me explain that. So in these cases, you're comparing the risk of developing a glioma, a brain cancer, comparing people that use their cell phones a lot as compared to people that do not. And if the odds ratio is greater than 1, this means that using your cell phone increases your risk of cancer. If it's less than 1, it means it decreases your risk of cancer. Then in addition, we commonly use the confidence interval as an indication of whether that result is statistically significant or not. So in these cases, if the lower bound of the confidence interval in the first study, it's 0.80, if that's less than 1.00, then it's not considered to be a statistically significant result at the 95% confidence limit interval. So even if it's above 1, we're still saying there are 5 chances out of 100 that this could have occurred by chance. But if you look at these individual studies, you see that in at least the bottom 3, there is a statistically significant elevation in risk of glioma on the side of the head where someone has used a cell phone held to their head for 10 years or more. And then the meta-analyses, these are reports where individuals have taken results from many different individual studies. They have pooled the results with some examination of the quality and the significance of each of the individual studies. And so this looks at the whole weight of the evidence. And what you see here in that each of these 5 meta-analyses demonstrate a statistically significant elevation in the risk of glioma on the side of the head that people traditionally hold their cell phone if they've been doing that for 10 years or more. Now, is this absolute proof? No, of course not. And these odds ratios, they're up to 2-fold. So it isn't to say that all brain cancer is caused by holding your cell phone to your head. But if you think about the people that have died of glioblastoma, start with Ted Kennedy, Boo Biden, Johnny Cochran, John McCain. The rates of these cancers have been increasing, especially the glioblastoma, which is the more serious form of glioma. I'm not saying that all of those people developed glioblastoma because of their cell phone use, but given their busy activities, they almost certainly were people that use cell phones regularly. Now, let me talk about another important study. This is the Interphone study. It was supported by the World Health Organization as well as the cell phone industry. It was a 13-country study, and it did not include the US or China, but it did include Canada. And hidden in the supplemental material were the results that after 10 years or more, there was more than a doubling of the increase in glioma, that if you were on your cell phone more than 1,640 hours, there was almost a doubling. And if you made more than 270 calls, there was a clear statistically significant increase. However, in this report, the results were hidden in the appendix, and the abstract said there was no increase in the risk of glioma or meningioma, whether you used a cell phone or not. So this gives you some indication of how political this whole question is. There's a large group of people that don't want to hear that using your cell phone causes brain cancer. And in fact, it took the director of the International Agency for Research on Cancer to force the committee that was analyzing and getting ready to publish these results to submit their results to the public. And the result was the significant results were hidden in supplemental material and not presented squarely in the abstract. One of the groups that's been most productive in this kind of investigation is Leonard Ardell and colleagues in Sweden. And they have this study on susceptibility of children. Now, what they're showing is that even 1 year of cell phone use is causing a significant increase in glioma in people of all ages. But for children under the age of 20, the increase is 5-fold within 1 year. This is really of concern because obviously there's no kid around in America today that doesn't have a cell phone and isn't on it quite often. Fortunately, a lot of them are texting. Nobody's demonstrated cancer of the thumbs. but a lot of them are holding them to their ears as well. And it appears that as you get older, the risk is less severe than it is for young children. Now, the industry is adamant in saying that there are no effects of non-thermal electromagnetic fields. And certainly it's clear there may be occasional situations where cell phones exceed the standards that are set, but that's not very common. This is a study by Nina Volkow, who's the director of one of the NIH institutes, certainly not a rabid frontier in this kind of person in this case. What she did is a study where she was using 2-deoxyglucose, which is a non-metabolizable form of glucose that accumulates in neurons in the brain, but is not metabolized. Neurons in the brain use only glucose as their form of energy development. So she did the 2-deoxyglucose with the cell phone held to the head. In one case, it was turned off. In the other case, it was turned on but muted so that there was no sound developing. What you see on the right is the pattern of metabolism of the brain of these people just in a resting state. You see the cortical areas, the yellow and oranges are indication of greater metabolism. When the cell phone is held to the head, turned on, but not muted. This is the way most people would wear their cell phone. You can see that there's a dramatic increase in the metabolism of the brain. The arrow indicates directly underneath the place where the cell phone was held, but there's also an increase in metabolism on the other side of the brain. So I think this result indicates without any question that an active cell phone held to the ear is causing penetration of that microwave radiation into the brain and causing changes in brain metabolism. So the idea that there are no health effects of microwave radiation at non-thermal intensities is just absolute nonsense. Nevertheless, that's the way that a great number of agencies believe to be the case, including our Federal Communications Commission. I'll come back to that a little bit later in my talk. Well, a few years ago, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, first they reviewed the cancer relations to 60 hertz and 50 hertz electromagnetic fields, which I started my involvement with in this whole area. And they rated them as possible human carcinogens. Later, they reviewed the radio frequency radiation. So this is what I've been talking about today. They also rated that as possible human carcinogens based on the results from the Interphone study, the Hardell group, but they didn't give a higher reading. And one of the major reasons for that was that there was no evidence that cell phone frequencies cause cancer in animals. Well, the next National Toxicology Program, about 3 years ago, released results. This turns out to be the most expensive study they've ever done. It was a 2-year exposure of rats to the intensities of radiation you would get by using your cell phone. And they used 2 different frequencies. And what they found was there was an increase in malignant schwannomas of the heart. Now, the schwannoma of the heart is the same cancer as the acoustic neuroma of the ear. Now, obviously, these rats weren't holding a cell phone to their head, so their total body was exposed. And this is absolutely convincing proof that, that cell phone radiation causes schwannomas. There were several weaker responses, including malignant gliomas of the brain, adenomas of the pituitary gland, pheochromocytomas of the adrenal cortex. And what is really quite important was there was a significant DNA damage observed in hippocampal neurons. So clearly, cell phone radiation causes cancer in animals. Many of us are urging the IARC to go back and review their recommendation again. Now, if that wasn't enough, almost at the same time, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy did a study, but with much lower intensities. These were intensities modeled after what you would get from your home if you lived near to a cell phone tower. They found a significant increase of schwannomas in the male rats. There was swan cell hyperplasia. There were an increase in glial tumors in both males and females, but they were not statistically significant. However, this combination of studies at cell tower intensities, as well as cell phone intensities, showing the same cancers in rodents that we see in people that use cell phones intensively, means that there's really no question that these microwave frequencies cause cancer, in spite of what the industry will say. Now, those are not by any means the only health effects. There's very strong evidence that exposure to cell phone frequencies reduce sperm counts. I like to tell people if a man uses his wireless laptop on his lap for probably 8 hours in a row, he probably doesn't need to wear a condom for the rest of the week. It's that significant. Now, that's, of course, a reversible effect as far as we know. There's some evidence for an increase in spontaneous abortion in women and premature birth, although I think that's not very well documented yet. A major concern that also hasn't been as well studied as we want is for effects on learning ability, especially in children, and memory defects in adults. I'll talk a little more about some aspects of that, but a big concern there is almost every school now has wireless computer labs where you have 10 or 20 students with wireless laptops, one powerful router. That means those kids are living in and studying in a room that's like a little microwave oven, but just that the intensity is not as great as you have in a microwave. But they're being continuously exposed to significant levels. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the most controversial aspect of electromagnetic field exposures, which is very relevant to 5G. And that's a syndrome called electrohypersensitivity. Some people, but certainly not all, fortunately not me, if they're in the presence of reasonably intense electromagnetic fields in the microwave frequency, will develop sense of brain fog, they'll end up with fatigue, they will have headaches, often heart palpitations, ringing in their ears, difficulty sleeping, and a general feeling of ill health that goes away when they're not in the exposure of the radio frequency fields. This is very interesting because there's long been this difference between the West and the Soviet or ex-Soviet countries in how they perceive dangers from electromagnetic fields. It's always been the position of the US government that there are no adverse health effects except those caused by tissue heating. But the Soviets long ago reported this syndrome of headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, depression, emotional instability, and irritability when people were exposed to radio frequency fields at intensities that were much lower than those associated with tissue heating. And in fact, in 1953, the Soviets irradiated the US embassy in Moscow with microwaves at intensities up to 0.2 watts per cubic meter. And this caused great anxiety everywhere. Congress ordered people from Johns Hopkins to look to see if there was elevated cancer. There was a general sense that the Soviets must know something we didn't. The US government passed off these symptoms that many of the employees in the embassy had as being just anxiety. But in fact, this is exactly what we see in electrohypersensitivity. Now bring forward to just the last 2 years. If you look at the New York Times, almost every third week, there'll be an article about US diplomats or CIA personnel in some country that suddenly develop strange sounds in their ears. They are ill and that illness doesn't go away. This was first described in Havana about 2 years ago, where a significant number of people developed what now is called the Havana syndrome, which is pure electrohypersensitivity. It is almost certainly a hostile act by some other group of people, nobody knows quite whom. But what happened in Havana now has been seen in recent years in Moscow, in Singapore, in Australia, in several other countries, always targeting US embassy personnel or CIA personnel in those countries. I think that this, well, the National Academy of Science reviewed this and they concluded that it was most likely microwaves. I think there's no definitive explanation yet, but this is so consistent with what we saw back in the 60s or the 50s when the Soviets were irradiating the US embassy. And I'll go on and show you some other personal stories of individuals that have been exposed to this kind of thing. Well, back in 1965, there was a fellow from the US Navy that did a whole series of studies on brain and behavior effects of non-thermal radiations, published them, they got no attention. Dr. Ray, who was from Texas, did a series of studies of people that reported they had this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity. If someone with that series of symptoms goes to their physician, they're usually referred to a psychiatrist, and some of them probably don't have effects from the electromagnetic fields, but have anxiety for other purposes. Dr. Ray looked at 100 people. He ended up studying 25 people who, when brought into a laboratory, would identify when the fields were on as compared to when the fields were not on. And that was all done in a blinded fashion. And he studied these people systematically, proving that they developed symptoms only when the fields were turned on, and they did not develop symptoms when the fields were not on. So that argues very strongly that this is a real syndrome. Now, I did a review of the literature, and it's interesting to go back. There are a whole series of reports, mostly in the military literature, of US service personnel exposed unintentionally to radar at extreme levels, radar microwaves. And Foreman reported on 2 men that were actually accidentally exported to radar. They developed headaches, inability to sleep, irritability, emotional lability, and it didn't go away over a whole year. Schilling in '97 reported on 3 men, same thing. Later, he studied people with the 3-year follow-up, and the symptoms had not gone away. Another report on 6 antenna engineers accidentally exposed to radar. Again, 4 of them developed this syndrome with no improvement. 2 of them, it sort of went away. This is a person I've met personally. This was a healthy technical expert on repair of radio frequency generation generating equipment from California. He was supposed to go in and repair the generators in a room that had 15 such generators. They were all supposed to be turned off, but 6 were not. He worked in there for about an hour, then he began to get a headache and nausea and dizziness. A month later, he still had these symptoms. He came to my office 2.5 years later. At that time, he had constant headaches, confusion, memory loss. This was a young guy. He was a big surfer. He was a big stud about town, and he became chronically ill. And to this day, that's not gone away. It's interesting, he's been followed by some of the neurologists there who find that he has some demyelinating areas in his brain. No previous diseases prior to this exposure. I think we haven't any other instance where we can demonstrate a brain lesion, but in this case, it was certainly an excessive exposure. Another person, this was, again, a relatively young man. He touched a live electric wire, lost consciousness, but subsequently he had this whole syndrome of electrosensitivity. Nobody knows why an electrocution event would trigger it, but it clearly did. So there are the number of people that report responding to excessive radio frequency fields with symptoms has been growing dramatically. I get letters and emails from people from around the world. I had one just the other day from a woman in Australia. People that find it difficult to live in an urban environment because of the cell towers that are everywhere and the fact that there's Wi-Fi everywhere. And some of these people are seriously disabled. While some of them may be attributing their symptoms to radio frequency fields when that's not the cause, I'm convinced that for some of them, it is the cause. All right, now we move on to 5G. Well, this is the future. There's no question about it. This is the Internet of Things. We're going to have smart appliances. We're going to have smart cities. We're going to have driverless cars. We're going to wear wireless devices and watches and glasses and earbuds and medical implants. And while all of this sounds really wildly exciting, the question is, what are the downsides? And are they understood and known? Well, I've sort of said this at the beginning, but let me review it again. Our current radio frequency transmission, that being radios, televisions, cell phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi, smart meters, all of those use frequencies that are less than 1 gigahertz. And as we go up in these generations, the frequency increases. 5G will use frequencies ranging from 0.6 to 24 gigahertz, and ultimately will go to even higher frequencies. And research is being done at frequencies up to 300 gigahertz. So the industry says that this will be 100 times faster than 4G. It will generate new jobs and it will add 500 billion to the economic growth. So 5G will be millimeter waves. That means the difference between all electromagnetic fields are sine waves. So these are waves that have millimeter spread. Remember, this is all traveling at the speed of light. So it does sound great. It means you'll be able to download movies much more rapidly than you can with current technology. And the industrial uses are almost unlimited in terms of what information can be added. Now, I didn't say earlier, and I should have, that while the electromagnetic field is a sine wave, a smooth sine wave, a lot of the information that is conveyed by radio, television, and everything else is information superimposed on that sine wave. And so that's how one transmits specific information. Well, what are the limitations of 5G? Well, the higher the frequency you go, the more easily blocked it is. And the problem with 5G is it doesn't go very far. It can be blocked by trees, by weather, by glass. So your 5G generator in the street can't penetrate your house. Rain and snow interfere with it. Now, in order to spread 5G around, what's happening is the utilities are putting mini cell towers on every street in front of about every fifth or eighth house. And the reason they have to do that is that the 5G signal doesn't travel miles like the current 3 and 4G. Cell towers, they have a range of over 2,000 kilometers, but at the higher frequency, the range is something like 20 meters, or maybe a little longer. So what this means is that the 5G cell towers are going to be on every street, everywhere, and you can't walk down the street without being constantly exposed. Now, if it were only 5G, maybe that wouldn't be so bad, but at the way we're going to the transition to 5G, we still have to have the 4G. Most people's cell phone doesn't accept 5G yet. They only accept 4G. Well, so these mini cell towers located in front of every 6th or 7th house are going to be pulsing out 4G as well as 5G. Now, we know that 4G is dangerous. We don't have very much, if any, information about 5G. So the concern is that the rollout of 5G, at least for the next decade or more, is going to increase all of our exposure to 4G. I've already shown you from the Ramazzini Institute study that the cell tower generation of 4G causes cancer. So that's a big problem. Now, the other big problem with 5G is the lack of any research. To my knowledge, there's no research in the US on health impacts of 5G. So why do we roll out something that is potentially dangerous without anybody doing the work to determine whether or not it is a hazard? There are a lot of logical reasons to suspect that 4G may be less dangerous, 5G may be less dangerous than 4G. Because it's more easily blocked, it's unlikely that 5G will penetrate your brain like 4G does. So it should not theoretically result in an increase in brain cancer. On the other hand, what about skin cancer? What about damage to eyes and ears? Those are reasonable concerns. But I think still the greatest danger that I see is the 5G is going to, in the short term at least, short term in terms of decades, going to be coupled with 4G. Is there anything bad about 5G? Well, without doing this study, how would you know? And this is just outrageous that nobody is even looking at this. Now, it's certainly what I suspect is the case, that like chemical exposures, what really is important for human health is your aggregate exposure. And that's going to be a great variety of frequencies. We already know that even the magnetic fields from 60 hertz fields can trigger electrohypersensitivity in certain people. So since our exposure is already increasing greatly from wireless everything, and actually I've published a plot of how starting in the early 2000s, the average exposure to most people has just increased almost in an exponential fashion as we've developed wireless everything. So our exposure is already great from the things we already have, from the cell phones, the cell towers, the Wi-Fi, the smart meters, and now we're going to have driverless cars. And of course, driverless cars are going to be totally dependent on electromagnetic fields. They're going to see the signs. Remember, GPS is electromagnetic fields. We've gotten so accustomed that we never think about where the sources are of all these things for devices that we find very useful and important, and ones that, I'm certainly not advocating going back to the pre-wireless age. I think that's out of the question, but what we need to do is find ways to use this technology without increasing the risk to human health. All right, so who's acting to protect us? Well, in the US, the Federal Communications Commission sets standards for all communications frequency. I and a colleague visited them about 4 years ago. They admitted they have absolutely no health expertise, and they depend on other agencies to advise them. They firmly believe there are no adverse health effects except those mediated by tissue heating. Most of the commissioners come from the cell phone industry. They've been described as a captured agency. I was one of the plaintiffs in a recent case against the FCC to require them at least to reconsider their standards that were set in 1996. It isn't to require them to change their view, but at least to reconsider and look at the evidence. Now, the other agency that takes advice from the, provides advice to the FCC is the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration is the federal agency that ordered the National Toxicology Program to do the study on cancer in rats and mice from cell phone radiation. The commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration has refused to accept the results of that study. And there's another legal case pending against the FDA for their refusal to acknowledge the results of the study that they paid for, and to require them to at least look carefully at the hundreds and thousands of studies that document adverse health effects at non-thermal intensities. So no great progress there. The Federal Communications Act of 1996 is interesting because this has a provision in the act that you can protest the placement of a cell phone tower near your home on the basis of it being ugly or that it might reduce your property value, but you cannot object to its placement on the basis of any health concern. Something snuck in by some lobbyist of the industry, which sounds so outrageous as to be obviously unconstitutional, but that's the law of the land passed by the US Congress. There have been attempts to remove that provision, but they've not been successful. So to sort of sum up where we are, how strong is the evidence for harm? Well, in any issue like this, you want to look at the weight of evidence, as is done in the meta-analysis. And every meta-analysis done to date has confirmed elevations in brain cancer and acoustic neuroma from excessive cell phone usage. There is increasing evidence for this electrohypersensitivity, some of the neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's, for which it's hard to understand the mechanism, but the evidence is quite strong, and the evidence for male infertility is strong. And that evidence gets stronger as time goes on. So I think, in my judgment, the weight of evidence for harm is significant. Now, is the harm in situations like this, where we all derive benefit from use of electromagnetic fields. The issue is how you balance the harm against the risk versus the benefit. And, the issue is really, if you deny that there's any harm from non-thermal levels, how can you begin to regulate the industry to reduce that harm without going to the extremes of saying you can't have the benefit? So, and then what about these other sources of radio frequency radiation? I've talked a little bit about them, but when you talk on your mobile phone, your cell phone held to your head, you get very intense exposure, but for the duration of your phone call. Most people, if you do not use a wired earpiece or something like that, you don't spend all day on the phone. But there are so many other sources of exposure that are on 24/7 that we're all exposed to. Most of our homes have Wi-Fi. Now smart meters are being put on almost everyone's home. A smart meter, if you don't know what they are, they're a meter that measures your electricity usage. It used to be you had a meter where either you had to go out and read the numbers on the meter that would determine your electric bill, or a person would have to come around and read that meter. Now the smart meters first they collect information by things put in all of your appliances, Zigbee drives that communicate to the smart meter how much electricity your refrigerator and your hairdryer are using. And then the smart meter uses radio frequency pulses to send to the utility. But the utilities don't use that information nearly as often as it's generated by the smart meter. And there are a number of situations where people that were not electrosensitive found a smart meter put on their house and then they become ill. So these sources are giving exposure 24/7. And so the aggregate net exposure may be much more than what you get just from your cell phone. Now, what are the mechanisms? And there's a whole large literature on this that I don't have time to go into, but let me just summarize it briefly. For both the extra low frequency electromagnetic fields and the radio frequency electromagnetic fields, there is very strong evidence that they lead to generation of reactive oxygen species, or what some people would call free radicals. There's not enough energy to directly break chemical bonds, but they generate reactive oxygen species that then can indirectly break chemical bonds. And then the whole series of biological effects that we have seen, changes in the blood-brain barrier, changes in cerebral blood flow, changes in brain metabolism, like I've shown you in Dr. Volkov's results. Many demonstrations of epigenetic changes of DNA, change of DNA damage, as was demonstrated in the National Toxicology Program results, changes in gene induction, changes in extracellular and intracellular calcium. We know all of these things occur as a result of exposure to electromagnetic fields. And we think that all of those are responsible for the elevations in cancer, the elevations in the electrohypersensitivity syndrome, also in the changes in brain function, the changes in reproductive function. So we have mechanisms in place. Now, are these mechanisms specific to electromagnetic fields? No, they're common mechanisms, and some of the symptoms are common, but that doesn't mean that they're not caused by the exposure to the electromagnetic fields. I've said it already that most current national and international standards are based on the assumption that there's no adverse effects except that from tissue heating. And this assumption is so wrong and so well documented. There are something like 10,000 references that are in the Bioinitiative report, which I should say is a very good reference for encyclopedic data on health effects of electromagnetic fields. It's online at www.bioinitiative.org. bioinitiative.org. I was the co-editor-in-chief of that document. So it's hard to understand why more steps are not taken to protect the health of the public, but there is the conflicts of interest and the opposition from the engineering and physics community. It's interesting, the engineering and physics community are the people that believe firmly there cannot be any adverse human health effect except from radiofrequency fields, except that caused by tissue heating. And why they would think that they have the ability and the insight to determine whether or not their adverse health effects is beyond me. So how serious is the problem? Well, exposure assessment is very poor. Most of the studies that have been done look at only one component of electromagnetic fields. I started in these studies where you were living near a power line, or you use a cell phone, or you live near a cell tower. But the reality is that all of us in our day-to-day activity move in and out of places where we're exposed to electromagnetic fields. So the exposure assessment is very poor. Now, in almost every situation where exposure assessment is very poor, and you find statistically significant associations, the reality is that the risk is much greater than you are calculating. And of particular concern is children, because children are more vulnerable to almost any environmental exposure. And children are more exposed than most adults because of their obsession with radio frequency devices. So just to conclude, there's already very convincing evidence for an elevation in cancer from excessive exposure to radio frequency fields. And that's also true for power line fields. Cancer has a long latency. Now, some of the people that argue against this say, well, if that's true, we should see these dramatic increases in cancer. Well, we are seeing some increases in cancer, at least in, in some countries, especially in Scandinavia, that has used cell phones longer than we have. But a concern is that we're going to see massive increases in cancer in the future. But the cautionary principle and just common sense require that when we have evidence that is strong and growing, we take steps to acknowledge the risk, find ways in which we can use technology well, but safely. And that's what I think the issue is. Now, specifically with regard to 5G, maybe it will be less harmful than our current 4G. But in the short term, it clearly is going to be more harmful. And we should not be rolling out things on a global basis at a time when we don't have evidence to know whether or not they cause significant harm. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions, and we'll try to answer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Carpenter, for sharing that great presentation and sharing your knowledge with us today. I would like to now open up our Q&A portion of the webinar. I've written down some great questions from the chat, so we're going to go ahead and dive right in.
Good.
The first question from Ricky Ott. Is there a list of countries that regulate use of cell phones for children, and do some countries ban such use?
Well, I'm not quite up to snuff on the answer to that question. I know that France has been on the leading edge of regulating and banning cell phone use by children under certain ages and limiting it above and beyond that. This is clearly a subject of major debate in just about every country of the world. Many countries have much more stringent requirements than the US does. Canada is about the same as the US. European countries have been perhaps more involved in the debate. Most of them have not required more rigorous standards, but it's an issue everywhere. France is the only country where I really know they've been very stringent in reducing exposure to children.
Okay, thank you. Jean Mendoza asks, how will we as a society mitigate these effects?
Well, again, the issue of cell phones has been around the longest, and there's a clear way to mitigate the effects. If you hold your active cell phone to your head, you're exposing your brain. Now, if you use a Bluetooth and have your cell phone in your pocket, you're exposing primarily your pelvis, a little bit of exposure to the brain, but reduced. If you use your cell phone on speaker and have it on your desk or table, you get almost no exposure to your body. These fields fall off dramatically with distance. If you use your cell phone with a wired earpiece and the cell phone isn't on your body, almost no exposure there. So it's an issue of getting it away from your body a little bit. Now that doesn't help in terms of protecting you from a cell phone tower exposure, obviously, or from Wi-Fi or something else. But it really does help. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your house and you turn it off at night, or you put the router somewhere away from where people are standing. It was interesting. I had a young guy from Estonia who visited me about a month ago, and he was expert at monitoring these fields. And it turns out my house is a pretty dirty place in terms of radio frequency fields. We have Wi-Fi, and we have a fairly powerful generator there. Although I didn't realize it, our telephone is set up to function as a deck phone, that being one where you can carry the receiver and go around the room. Well, that is all done by radio frequency fields. And we have a printer and scanner that also is Wi-Fi. And if you go near that, you get elevated exposure. So, one thing that certainly people can do is get one of these meters and look at your environment. We don't use the deck phone. That was just a waste of our exposure. If you wire your printer, if you have wired internet, there is zero exposure. It's a little less convenient, but wired everything has no radio frequency exposure. So there are things that can be done.
Okay, thank you. Another question related to that is, other than using wired headphones, are there ways to protect ourselves? David says he's aware of a product called a safe sleeve, a cover over the phone or using a speakerphone.
Well, there are a number of products on the market. I think I wouldn't recommend any of them. If you cover your phone with a safe sleeve, you're not going to be able to use it because it won't be able to communicate. Someone came to my office with a pendant that they said would block radio frequency fields. In my days of dealing with magnetic fields, someone was offering a magnetic shield underwear that women could wear to protect themselves. I think this is an area where scams are common. And if there are devices and so forth suggested, I would certainly suggest you get meters. These meters are not that expensive. I think mine was $300, and it monitors both extra low frequency and radio frequency fields. Explore your environment and find where you're generating these fields. And there usually is a way to reduce your exposure without impacting the quality of life.
Thank you. What about Verizon's claims that their 5G goes 2,000 to 3,000 feet and passes through walls?
I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. If that is the case, then the 5G is going to penetrate your brain. So I hope it's not the case that happens, but it's, their little mini cell towers are going to have 4G. It may be the 4G that's going that far and penetrating your walls and so forth. There needs to be independent research on these issues by engineer types that are open to really doing the analysis. I'm certainly not that person, but if it's truly 5G, I don't believe that it will penetrate walls.
Thank you. Another question is, can you explain in a little more detail how 5G exposure could damage skin and possibly lead to skin cancer? Is it heating tissue or something else?
Well, yes, all of these electromagnetic fields heat tissue. I mean, I talked about infrared radiation, about using your microwave oven. So 5G doesn't penetrate so far, but it still will cause heating of the tissue. Now, I sort of made it sound like the heating was sort of an all or nothing effect. It really is not. The regulations are designed to prevent measurable heating. So even low levels are going to cause some heating. How much that low heating that's below the level you can detect is related to the adverse health effects is not clear. But clearly the 5G, it may not penetrate beyond the skin, but it's going to do its thing, which will include heating in the skin. And if Verizon is right, it's going to penetrate lots further than the skin.
Thank you. Another related question is, how does exposure to RF create brain issues that last for so long and not just during the exposure? What's going on in the brain?
Well, what's going on in the brain, if you recall the slide on mechanisms that I showed you, if you're getting DNA damage, if you're getting change in brain metabolism, that probably is transient. But changes in epigenetic changes in DNA damage, these things are going to give long-lasting effects. Now, this Havana syndrome, we really don't understand. We don't know how these exposures, whether it's radar or the hostile exposure that seems to underlie these effects in US Embassy personnel, I don't know how that is long lasting. The point is that all the evidence indicates that it is long lasting and therefore should be taken seriously. We need to understand what the mechanisms are. And at this point, I don't think any of us really understand that, but the evidence that there are long-term effects is very clear.
Thank you. And somebody asked, does a glucometer expose you to EMF?
Does it what?
Expose you to EMF.
A glucose meter?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it does, but I don't know.
Oh, they meant insulin pump, correction.
And again, I don't know the answer to that. But, implanted wireless devices all the time. I strongly suspect that is involve EMF. But in the end, one of the questions is, does it generate an electromagnetic signal only when it's being used, or is it constant?
Okay, thank you. Barbara Quinn, it looks like you have your hand up. I'll ask you to unmute. There you are.
I think I'm unmuted. Yes, I have a question for Dr. Carpenter. Thanks for that. That's a great presentation, really thought-provoking. As I was looking around at some of the information about 5G, I happened to notice that there's a New York Times article that says the 5G health hazard that isn't. And they go through and list various quotes from various science people, physicists, for instance. And
yeah, I was widely quoted in that article, and I was viewed as being a pawn of the Russian government, because I was asked to talk on Russian TV about this subject. So I've added that to my CV, that in addition to be a variety of other things, I'm a pawn of the Russian government.
Yes, I didn't get that. I didn't quite catch that. But what was a little disconcerting at the end of the article, I read through the article. At the end of the article, there was an advertisement for Verizon 5G. And it was just a little bit unsettling to read the long article and then realize that Verizon is obviously an advertiser with the paper. And that advertisement was placed at the bottom of the article. And so I don't know, it seems like there's not enough information out there, and some of the information might be a little suspect. But I guess my question is this, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has sort of been inconsistent on this subject. Do you see
Well,
that changing in the future, or is there?
Yeah, and that's a good question. Conflicts of interest are everywhere. I went with colleagues from Europe to the World Health Organization in Geneva to argue with people there about their status on this issue. Now, one thing that wasn't said in the introduction, I direct the Collaborating Center of the World Health Organization through the same office that's responsible for their radio frequency rating. They have an official NGO of the World Health Organization, this International Committee for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which is filled with people with conflicts of interest. It was set up by a person that was employed by the World Health Organization before he became an executive in the cell phone industry in Italy. And it's a self-appointed group, always people that accept this idea that there are no adverse health effects except those caused by tissue heating. And the World Health Organization won't change their position. Let me tell you another story. I did a review of the literature on the associations between magnetic field exposure from electricity and childhood leukemia. In 2000, there were 3 meta-analyses published, all showing that children exposed to high magnetic fields from electricity had a statistically significant elevation in rates of leukemia. There have been a number of studies since 2000, and I went through them and calculated their results depending on who funded the studies. I think there was about 10 studies funded by universities or foundations, and only one of those had partial funding from the utility. All of those studies found a statistically significant elevation in childhood leukemia. There were a number, 8 or so studies that were funded by universities that showed elevated odds ratios, but they were not statistically significant. And then there were another 8 studies, all funded by the industry, none of which reported any adverse health effect. Now, you really have to look at who supports the study before you believe it. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a controversial subject. There are a lot of individuals and a lot of institutions that have every financial conflict of interest in this issue. And they spread the view that the health effects results are inconsistent and inconclusive. And if you just look at all of the literature, they are inconsistent and inconclusive because the industry corrupts the scientific literature with studies that are clearly in conflict and report results that are not consistent with those that are done by independent people.
Interesting. Thank
If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to provide that publication on the conflicts of interest.
All right, thank you. We have a few more questions and a little bit more time. Let's see. Have you seen general symptoms of radio frequency exposure increase in the population as our Wi-Fi everything product use increases? And are these symptoms being considered depression, anxiety, or something else?
Well, certainly, it's a little hard to answer that question because clearly more people are becoming aware of this debate. And the whole issue of the Havana syndrome and the press that's gotten, the National Academy of Science panel that concluded this was almost certainly microwave radiation, that's increased awareness to a great degree. Now, increased awareness does not necessarily correspond to increased prevalence of a disease. My impression is that the prevalence is increasing, and it's in proportion to the increase in exposure that we have almost all over the world. But I don't have really firm evidence to document that.
Okay, thank you. Another question similar is, what symptoms of constant low RF exposure should we look out for, especially in children? And what steps can we take at home to lessen our exposure? I know you've touched on that second part already.
Yeah, certainly wire up everything, turn off your Wi-Fi at night. Don't let the kids have a cell phone when they go to bed. I've sort of forgotten the first part of that question, but I think it was related to reducing exposure.
The first part was what symptoms of constant
Uh-huh.
low RF exposure should we look out for, especially in children?
Well, ringing in the ears is one symptom that is very common with low-level exposure. And my wife has this, and she found she was always getting ringing in her ears when she was sitting in her easy chair watching television, and not when she went away. And it turned out that was that was an area of high exposure. And when we moved some devices around, she hasn't been complaining any longer. But very common is sleep disruption. Obviously, many causes of sleep disruption, but exposure to EMF is certainly one. The evidence for children not doing so well academically, there are many reasons for that, of course, also, but one is excessive exposure to radio frequency fields.
Interesting, thank you. A couple older questions from Ricky Ott. She asked, do some countries restrict human habitation within a certain radius of cell towers and ban them on certain structures like fire stations? Are you aware of any countries like that?
No, I'm not aware of any country. I think there are some countries that do ban residents too close to cell towers, but I don't know specifically what those countries are, or if in fact that's really the case. It's interesting. I was invited to go to Los Angeles when there was a plan to put cell towers on every fire station. I think fortunately that didn't develop because firemen were not anxious to have cell towers and exposure coming from the cell towers so close to where they were working. But the issue has been that the companies want to put cell towers everywhere as the need arises for use, and on public buildings, that's always the first place to go. A lot of issue on cell towers on schools because the companies will pay the schools who never have enough money to put a cell tower on the school, and that's the last place you should put something that's going to increase the exposure to children.
Thank you. Another question from Ricky is, do you know of what groups individuals are suing and who in Congress are our allies?
What groups? Well, the group against the FCC was the Children's Environmental Trust. I forget the names of these organizations, even the one that I'm involved in. The two leads, one is Daphne Talkover, who's an American Israeli who is a lawyer, and and Deborah Davis, who has led the other group. And they had separate suits. They were required to join together jointly, and that was one with the DC court, district court. The suit against the FDA, I don't think has been filed yet, but it's a group of lawyers that are getting close to filing that suit.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have from everybody. You're welcome to ask some more in the chat real quick. We have about 10 minutes left of our program. If there's anything else you'd like to say, Dr. Carpenter, please go ahead.
I think I said my piece.
Okay. Well, I guess that brings our webinar to an end.
I would say that I would be quite happy to have people email me questions if they have them, and I can provide information, but most of it is online, and it's important for people to be aware of this. It is controversial. Certainly the evidence for harm is not as strong as it is for a lot of the other environmental exposures that I deal with every day. But I'm convinced that it's a real hazard, and that it's one that by taking steps that are not going to adversely affect your quality of life, you can reduce your exposure to you and your family.
Thank you. A few more questions came in. Susan asks, everyone sleeps with their cell phone and arm's reach away. Can we ask Apple, etc., to program an option for automatic timeout for Bluetooth?
Well,
question.
I think it's foolish to sleep with your cell phone. I mean, why do you want to take calls in the middle of the night? You know, maybe across the room for emergencies only. But I'm not sure that Apple or any other of the providers are going to want to accommodate you on that regard.
Thank you. And Ricky asks, any evidence of 5G exposure and COVID?
You know, in this era of paranoia, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever. There are a group of people that are sort of, they're part of the anti-vaxxers for the most part, that are absolutely convinced that cell phones and COVID have some nasty interrelationship. I don't buy that. I don't know of any evidence that that is the case. Now, there is some concern that some of the symptoms that we see in the long hauler COVID patients are rather like those in electrohypersensitivity. And I think that's what's sort of feeding this concern. These non-specific symptoms we see in multiple chemical sensitivity, in chronic fatigue, and a number of symptoms that are now being considered to be really quite well established. There may be commonalities in what triggers symptoms of fatigue and brain fog, but that doesn't mean that they're one and the same.
Thank you. And we'll do one last question. Yes, one last question from Jackie, or sorry, not Jackie, Robin. Would mobile data expose you as much as Wi-Fi?
Again, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good
Okay.
question, but you know, one would really need to take measurements of what each of them was generating. I would recommend getting a meter. Take measurements in your own environment.
Thank you. Okay, I guess this concludes the end of the webinar. Thank you all again for attending. And of course, thank you, Dr. Carpenter. That was extremely informative. A recording will be made of today's presentation and placed on the NWTCC's website, where you will be able to watch it again or send the link out to friends and family. And Dr. Carpenter did invite you to send him questions. So would you like to share your contact information with everyone?
Yeah, it's dcarpenter@albany.edu. Very easy.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you have the great rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter.
Thanks. My pleasure.